March 6, 1943. 0830 hours. Jebel Kouif, Tunisia. The jeep carrying Lieutenant General Georges Patton Jr. rolled to a stop outside 2nd Corps headquarters. The dust hadn't settled when Patton stepped out, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, jaw set like granite. He had been in command of the United States 2nd Corps for exactly 17 minutes. Around him, the administrative compound looked orderly enough. Tents aligned. Equipment stacked. Vehicles parked in neat rows. But Patton saw something else. He saw an army that had been broken. An army that had run. An army that had lost 6,000 men in 48 hours to Rommel's panzers at a mountain pass called Kasserine. And he saw the reason why standing right in front of him. A major from the operations staff approached to brief the new commander. No salute. Uniform rumpled. Boots unpolished. And no helmet. Patton's eyes locked onto that bare head like a gun sight finding its target. "Where's your helmet, Major?" The officer hesitated. Started to explain that he'd just stepped out of the operations tent for a moment, that enemy aircraft hadn't been active in this sector, that, "You're relieved. Report to the rear for reassignment." 30 minutes into command. First officer fired. The major stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Around them, other officers watched in silence. Some with shock. Some with barely concealed satisfaction. All of them suddenly very aware of their own uniforms, their own helmets, their own distance from the new commander's standards. Patton didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked into the headquarters tent, boot heels striking the ground with the rhythm of an execution drum. Behind him, the major remained standing in the dust, career effectively ended, the first casualty of a purge that would reshape the American army in North Africa. What none of them understood yet was that this wasn't about a helmet. This was about accountability. About the systematic destruction of a culture that had allowed American soldiers to be slaughtered in a mountain pass while their commanders stayed safe in the rear. About 10 days that would determine whether the United States could field an army capable of facing the Wehrmacht on equal terms. And it would be brutal. The disaster at Kasserine Pass had ended only 2 weeks earlier, but the psychological wounds were still raw. Between February 14th and February 22nd, 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps had punched through American positions in central Tunisia with shocking efficiency. Panzer divisions exploited inexperience and poor positioning. American units broke and ran. Entire battalions surrendered. Equipment was abandoned. The retreat had been chaotic, disorganized, and deeply humiliating. 6,000 American casualties. Thousands more demoralized. And across the Atlantic, newspaper headlines were asking the question that terrified Washington: could American troops actually fight? The German assessment was even harsher. Rommel himself had written in his after-action report that American soldiers showed courage but were poorly led at all levels. German intelligence officers noted that American battalion and regimental commanders frequently remained at headquarters during combat, directing operations by radio rather than leading from the front. Prisoner interrogations revealed units where soldiers didn't know their officers' names, where coordination between infantry and armor was non-existent, where basic fire discipline had collapsed under pressure. The Wehrmacht had fought the British for 3 years. They had faced the Soviets in battles of annihilation. And now they had measured the Americans and found them wanting. That assessment reached Patton before he ever set foot in Tunisia. He had been pulled from planning the invasion of Sicily specifically to fix 2nd Corps. Eisenhower's orders were direct: restore fighting capability and morale within 30 days. The Corps needed to attack at Guettar in mid-March to support British operations. There was no time for gradual reform. No time for careful personnel reviews. No time for anything except immediate, ruthless intervention. Patton understood something that most of his contemporaries did not. He understood that an army's performance in combat is directly proportional to the standards its officers enforce every single day. Not just in battle, but in the administrative rear. Not just with tactics, but with appearance, discipline, and the thousand small details that separate professional soldiers from armed civilians. The German army had learned this over decades. Their officers led from the front because that was the expectation. Their soldiers maintained discipline under fire because discipline had been drilled into them in every moment of peacetime. Their coordination worked because staff work was treated as sacred. The American Army had not learned this yet, and Kasserine Pass was the price. Patton's first full day in command began with an inspection, not of frontline positions, not of defensive preparations, of the headquarters itself. He walked through the operations center, the communications tent, the supply depot, the motor pool. And at each location he found the same thing: officers and men who had relaxed into the casual rhythms of a rear area posting. Uniforms unbuttoned, leggings missing, enlisted men failing to salute, officers conducting briefings while sitting down, maps poorly maintained, reports submitted late, equipment stored haphazardly. To an outsider, these would seem like minor infractions, trivial concerns in the aftermath of a major defeat. But Patton saw them as symptoms of the disease that had killed American soldiers at Kasserine Pass. An army that doesn't salute doesn't fight, he told his assembled staff that evening. An officer who doesn't wear his helmet doesn't lead. A soldier who doesn't maintain his weapon doesn't survive. Then he issued the orders that would define his command. Every officer and enlisted man in 2nd Corps would wear full regulation uniform at all times, including helmet and leggings, regardless of location or duty. No exceptions. Failure to comply would result in immediate relief and reassignment to the rear. Every tent, every vehicle, every piece of equipment would be maintained to peacetime garrison standards. Inspections would be conducted daily, without warning, at all levels of command. All officers would conduct daily inspections of their own units using the same standards. Battalion commanders would inspect companies. Regimental commanders would inspect battalions. Division commanders would inspect regiments. And Patton himself would inspect divisions. Any officer found in the rear during combat operations without explicit authorization would be immediately relieved of command. The orders were posted at 2,100 hours on March 6th. By 0600 hours on March 7th, Patton was already conducting his first field inspection. He arrived unannounced at the 1st Infantry Division's forward positions near Gafsa. The division had performed reasonably well at Kasserine, holding its ground while units on its flanks collapsed, but Patton wasn't interested in past performance. He wanted to see present standards. What he found satisfied him in some ways and horrified him in others. The frontline troops looked sharp. Weapons clean. Positions well maintained. Officers present with their men. But as he moved back toward the rear echelons, the standards deteriorated. Supply units operating without proper security. Communications personnel in improper uniform. And at the division headquarters, he found a battalion commander who had not visited his companies in the line for 3 days. "Why aren't you with your men?" Patton asked. The lieutenant colonel explained that he was coordinating resupply operations, managing casualty reports, preparing for a possible enemy attack. All valid reasons. All administratively sound. "You're relieved," Patton said. "Your executive officer will take command. You'll report to Corps headquarters for reassignment." The lieutenant colonel started to protest. Started to explain his reasoning. Started to appeal to the division commander standing nearby. Patton cut him off. "In this corps, battalion commanders lead from the front. If you're needed at headquarters, your executive officer can handle it. If your presence is required in the rear, you're not doing your job properly in the first place. You're relieved. That's final." Second officer fired. 36 hours into command. Word spread through 2nd Corps like electricity through water. Patton wasn't making examples. He wasn't selectively enforcing standards. He was systematically purging any officer who failed to meet his requirements, regardless of rank, regardless of connections, regardless of past performance. And he was doing it personally. Over the next 8 days, Patton conducted field inspections across the entire Corps. He visited every division, every regiment, every battalion headquarters he could reach. He arrived without warning, usually at dawn, and spent hours examining positions, questioning officers, observing procedures. And wherever he found deficiency, he acted immediately. A regimental commander who had established his headquarters 12 miles behind the front line was relieved on the spot. Patton's assessment: if you can't hear your own artillery, you're too far back. A battalion executive officer found without his helmet during an inspection was relieved within the hour. Patton's reasoning: if a major won't wear his helmet because it's uncomfortable, what will he do when leading his men becomes uncomfortable? A supply officer who failed to maintain proper vehicle logs was relieved and reassigned. Patton's logic: an officer who can't maintain a simple logbook can't maintain a supply line under fire. But Patton wasn't just firing officers. He was also promoting them. A captain who had led a successful counterattack at Kasserine, holding his position while units on both flanks retreated, found himself promoted to major and given command of a battalion. A lieutenant who had organized a night raid that captured German prisoners and intelligence was jumped 2 grades to captain and made a company commander. A major who had kept his artillery battery in action under tank attack, personally manning a gun when crew members were wounded, was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given a battalion. The pattern became clear. Patton was removing officers who led from the rear and elevating officers who led from the front. He was purging commanders who prioritized personal safety and promoting commanders who shared risk with their men. He was systematically reshaping the officer corps based on a single criterion: combat leadership. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Officers who had grown comfortable in rear headquarters suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. The calculation changed overnight. Staying in the rear was no longer safe. It was career suicide. The only path to survival was to be with your troops, to share their danger, to lead by example. Enlisted men noticed. They saw their battalion commanders appearing in the line more frequently. They saw staff officers conducting inspections in forward positions. They saw the distance between leadership and lead shrinking with each passing day. And they drew their own conclusions about what had changed. Meanwhile, Patton continued his inspections. On March 10, he visited the 9th Infantry Division, which had been badly mauled at Kasserine. The division commander, Major General Mantonetti, had already begun his own reforms, but Patton pushed harder. He found a company commander whose position showed signs of poor maintenance. Foxholes improperly dug. Firing positions poorly sighted. No overhead cover despite available materials. The company commander was relieved within the hour. But Patton didn't stop there. He questioned the battalion commander about why such deficiencies had been allowed to persist. The battalion commander acknowledged that inspections had been irregular, that he had trusted his subordinates to maintain standards without direct supervision. Trust is not a leadership technique, Patton said. Inspection is. You're responsible for everything your battalion does or fails to do. If you don't inspect it, you don't know what's happening. And if you don't know what's happening, you're not commanding. The battalion commander was not relieved, but he understood that he had come within a razor's edge of losing his command. That evening, he conducted a complete inspection of every company position in his battalion. The next morning, he did it again. And the morning after that. Across 2nd Corps, the same pattern repeated. Officers learned that Patton's standards were not suggestions. They were requirements. And failure to meet them had immediate, career-ending consequences. But the purge was not random. Patton was not simply firing officers to establish dominance or satisfy personal preferences. He was systematically identifying and removing the specific leadership failures that had caused the disaster at Kasserine Pass. Officers who remained in headquarters during combat operations were removed because soldiers had died at Kasserine while their commanders stayed safely in the rear, unable to make real-time decisions or provide leadership when units broke under pressure. Officers who failed to maintain equipment standards were removed because American tanks and vehicles had broken down at critical moments during the battle, leaving units immobile and vulnerable. Officers who tolerated poor discipline were removed because American units at Kasserine had failed to coordinate, failed to communicate, failed to maintain cohesion under fire. Each relief was a lesson. Each promotion was a model. The entire officer corps was being taught, through demonstration and consequence, what Patton considered essential for combat effectiveness. And it was working. By March 12, 6 days into Patton's command, the transformation was visible. 2nd Corps headquarters looked like a different organization. Officers moved with purpose. Uniforms were immaculate. Salutes were sharp. Briefings were crisp. The casual atmosphere that had characterized the rear area after Kasserine was gone, replaced by a tension that was somehow both stressful and energizing. In forward positions, the change was even more pronounced. Battalion commanders who had previously managed their units by radio were now living in forward command posts. Company officers who had rotated to the rear for rest were now staying with their platoons. The distance between ranks had collapsed. Leaders and lead were occupying the same physical space, sharing the same risks, facing the same dangers. German reconnaissance reports noted the change. Prisoner interrogations revealed that American units were now led by officers who appeared in the front lines regularly. Captured documents showed that American battalion commanders were conducting personal reconnaissances of German positions. Wehrmacht intelligence assessments, circulated at corps level, warned that American tactical leadership had significantly improved and that German forces should expect more aggressive and competent resistance. But Patton wasn't finished. The real test was coming. On March 17, 11 days after Patton took command, 2nd Corps launched Operation WWII, the attack on Guettar. The objective was to break through German defensive positions in eastern Tunisia, threatening Axis supply lines and supporting British operations further north. The attack would pit American infantry and armor against German defensive positions prepared by veterans of the Afrika Korps. It would be the first American offensive operation since Kasserine Pass. And it would reveal whether Patton's brutal 10-day transformation had actually changed anything that mattered. The attack began at 0600 hours with an artillery barrage that shook the desert floor. American infantry advanced behind the barrage, moving with a coordination and discipline that had been absent at Kasserine. When German positions opened fire, American units didn't break. They maneuvered. They supported each other. They pressed forward. Battalion commanders were present in the assault, directing fire, adjusting tactics, rallying troops when momentum stalled. The officers who had survived Patton's purge were proving why they had survived. They led. They adapted. They fought. By nightfall on March 17, American forces had penetrated German defensive lines and established positions that threatened the entire Axis position in central Tunisia. The fighting would continue for days, but the initial assault had succeeded. 2nd Corps had attacked, and 2nd Corps had won. German after-action reports noted the change explicitly. A captured situation report from the 10th Panzer Division stated, American infantry demonstrated significantly improved combat effectiveness. Unit cohesion maintained under fire. Leadership present at company and battalion level. Recommend revised assessment of American tactical capability. It was the assessment Patton had been driving toward for 10 days. But the human cost of his methods was real. 23 officers relieved from 2nd Corps between March 6 and March 17. Most would never return to combat command. Their careers were effectively over, ended not by enemy action but by their own commander's judgment that they had failed to meet the standards required for leading men in battle. Some of the relieved officers protested. Some appealed to higher headquarters. Some argued that Patton's standards were unrealistic, that his expectations were impossible, that no commander could meet such requirements consistently. Patton's response was simple: the officers I promoted are meeting those standards every day. If they can do it, anyone can. And if you can't, you don't belong in command. Years later, after the war, historians and military analysts would debate Patton's methods. Some would argue that his approach was necessary, that the shock of Kasserine Pass required equally shocking intervention, that only brutal accountability could transform military culture quickly enough to matter. Others would argue that his methods were excessive, that capable officers were destroyed by unrealistic standards, that leadership by fear was ultimately counterproductive. But the officers who survived Patton's purge told a different story. Omar Bradley, who served under Patton at 2nd Corps before eventually commanding him in Europe, wrote in his memoirs that Patton's 10 days of accountability created a staff and a command structure that understood leadership was not a desk job. The officers promoted during that period, Bradley noted, went on to command divisions and corps in Europe, proving that Patton's judgment of combat leadership was sound. The battalion commander who replaced the officer relieved on Patton's first day of inspections would command a regiment at D-Day and a division by the end of the war. The captain promoted for his actions at Kasserine would earn the Distinguished Service Cross at Sicily and command a battalion across France. The lieutenant who led the night raid would survive the war as a full colonel, having commanded at every level from platoon to regiment. And the officers relieved by Patton? Almost none returned to combat leadership. Some served in administrative positions. Some were reassigned to training commands in the United States. Some left the military entirely after the war. Their careers had ended in the 10 days between March 6 and March 17, 1943. The lesson was clear, and it reverberated through the American Army for the rest of the war. Leadership was not theoretical. Standards were not negotiable. And accountability started at the top and worked its way down without exception or mercy. Patton left 2nd Corps in mid-April to prepare for the Sicily invasion. His replacement, Omar Bradley, inherited an organization transformed almost beyond recognition from the defeated force that had stumbled out of Kasserine Pass. The purge had worked. The accountability had mattered. The brutal 10 days had saved not just 2nd Corps, but the credibility of American military leadership. In later battles, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, in Germany, the officers who had survived Patton's purge would prove their worth repeatedly. They would lead divisions through hedgerows and across rivers. They would command corps through desperate winter battles. They would make the split-second decisions that saved lives and won battles. And they would carry with them the lesson learned in those 10 days, that leadership means being present, that command means sharing danger, that responsibility means accountability not just for success but for every single failure, no matter how small. The helmet Patton demanded that first major wear wasn't about the helmet. It was about the principle that every standard matters, that every detail reflects commitment, that an army is built from the ground up through relentless, uncompromising attention to the fundamentals of military discipline. And when American soldiers hit the beaches at Normandy 14 months later, they were led by officers who understood that principle. Officers who had been taught, through demonstration and consequence, that leadership was not a privilege but a responsibility measured in shared risk and relentless accountability. The 10 days that saved the army were brutal. They were unforgiving. And they worked. March 17, 1943. 2,100 hours. Guettar, Tunisia. Patton stood outside his command post, watching the horizon where artillery flashes still lit the night sky. Around him, staff officers prepared situation reports, casualty summaries, logistics assessments. The administrative machinery of war grinding forward. But Patton wasn't thinking about reports. He was thinking about the battalion commanders out there in the dark, in the line with their men. The officers who had survived his purge and proven themselves in combat. The leaders who would carry the American army through the battles still to come. He had fired 23 officers in 10 days. He had ended careers, crushed ambitions, destroyed reputations. And he would do it again without hesitation if circumstances required it. Because the alternative was Kasserine Pass. The alternative was defeat. The alternative was more dead soldiers, more broken units, more newspaper headlines questioning whether Americans could fight. Patton had answered that question. Not with speeches or training or tactics. With accountability. With the simple, brutal principle that officers who failed to lead did not deserve to command. The helmet had been the first test. Guettar was the proof. And the officers who survived would remember both for the rest of their lives.